Hello, good afternoon from the Sensenelec Management Center in Brussels, and welcome to our second webinar for standard drafters. The title for today's webinar is Templates, Structures, and Introductory Elements. My name is Alicia Booth. I am an editor in the Standards Publications unit, and I will be presenting today with my colleague.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Pelagi. I'm an editor and I've been working in CCMC for about 10 years now.
Before we begin, we want to invite you to use the question and answer panel to share any experiences that you've had or to ask questions that come up during the presentation. You can submit your questions in writing as shown here. And depending on how much time we have, we will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. If we do not get to your question, please know that a recording of the webinar and all questions and answers will be published online at the Sensenelec website training pages. The link and the path are shown here. Okay, so the main topics that we'll cover in the webinar today include, first, the standard template for drafters, also known as the STD template. In relation to this, we will also discuss how a typical EN is structured. And lastly, we will take a close look at the rules regarding titles, European forewords, introductions, and scopes of ENs. So to start with the STD template, what is the purpose of the template, and why might it be useful to you? Well, although it is not required that you use it, it was created as a helpful tool for the drafters of ENs. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it uses a system of macros to help ensure that your document will have the correct layout, as well as the most up-to-date boilerplate text for certain clauses. And in so doing, it allows for more efficient drafting and editing of the text. It is also designed to suit the rules in the Internal Regulations Part 3, which was most recently updated in 2015, and the STD template is updated accordingly. It may be also interesting for you to know that it is based on the ISO template. So, if you are interested in using it, it can be found on the SenBoss at the website shown here. It is under Reference Material, Forms and Templates. You click on the link here to download the file. And this is publicly available and freely accessible to both Sen and Senelec members. Also, for candidate harmonized drafts, the new Annex Z templates, which were approved by the BT last year, can also be found at this same website. Of course, these are Annex ZA, so this applies only to Sen. But for those looking for the new Annex ZZ templates for Senelec, which were also updated last year, here is a link to the Senelec website, and here is the path to find the correct forms and templates. Okay, so I will now hand over to Cynthia, who will explain how the STD template works. And she will also go through some of the main steps.
Okay, so once you've installed the templates on your computer, you can give it a go and you find an add-in in your Word document. The first thing you need to go to is the Doc Info tab, where you can provide the main information for the document by filling all the fields necessary. As you can see in this window, all the information that you need to include are the TC number, the TC title, the TC secretariat. Also, you have to add the work item, the reference number, possibly the month and the year of the launch. Also the stage code, whether it is a SEN inquiry or UAP. If you are revising an older document, this is where you have to update the document information. Also, please pay attention to these little boxes with mandate and directive. If your standard is a harmonized standard, then you will need to tick the box Mandate Directive. Once all the information have been filled in, you can click on Next. It will then open another window. In this particular window on the left, you can insert the information about the titles. You have to insert the English title. If you have it, you can also add the French and the German titles. If you want, you can also add the ICS code. But more importantly, on the window on your right, you can see that you have the information on the replaced document. So if you standard revise a previous edition, that's where you have to put all the information about superseding notes. When you've done all of this, you can click End. That was step 1. Then now step 2, you can start building your document by using the other tab, the Element tab. In this window, you will find all the clauses, subclauses that you will need to build the body of your document. It is really interesting because you will have the correct layout, the correct font, and also the correct font size. When we talk about normative references and terms and definition, it is really useful because you will have the proper boilerplate. You can also add all kinds of annexes, whether they are informative or normative, and also the annexes Z. So now Leah will show you the result of all this and how the standard should look like.
Okay, so once you've finished entering the main information for the text and choosing all the necessary elements and clicked OK, you will see before you a draft outline of your document with all of the clauses and subclauses you've selected and all of the details that you've entered. So I will now show you an example of what your document might look like, and we'll go through each section. Here is the title page with reference and title, followed by a table of contents. Then we have a European foreword with the reference number, the stage, the superseding note, and the mandate information if ticked. The introduction and scope, the normative references and terms and definitions with the appropriate boilerplate text. And you'll see here examples of references and terms, the correct layout, followed by some clauses you might have selected. Then an example of a normative annex. This would be an informative annex if chosen. If you have selected the Annex Z element, you will get a template for the generic Annex ZA to serve as a guideline. And lastly, the bibliography. So this is just one example of how a standard might be structured. Of course, not every element shown here is mandatory for every EN, but I will go through a list of some of the mandatory elements for every European standard. The first is the title, of course, a table of contents, the European foreword, the scope, and of course the main body of the text, which can also include figures, tables, and formulas. The optional elements of an EN are the introduction, the normative references clause, the terms and definitions clause, any annexes, and the bibliography. Okay, so now we're getting towards the end of our first section on the templates, but before we move on, we'd like to make you aware of some recent changes that we've made and upcoming changes. Firstly, for those of you who have been using the template for some time, there is a new version of the STD template available on the SendBoss that you can download. Also, we are currently working to develop a simple template without macros for both Sen and Senelec. It will be two separate templates for Sen and Senelec, which will be made available once they've been approved in the pilot phase, which will last through this summer.
Also, one important thing to remember is that ISO and IEC are currently revising their directives Part 2. They will very soon publish a new edition. You have to know, or you know maybe, that our internal regulations Part 3 are based on these ISO IEC directives Part 2. So it means that in the near future, we will also have to update our own internal regulations Part 3. Of course, you will be notified very soon when these internal regulations are available. So please watch out for the new edition. So we will now start the second part of our webinar, but if you have questions on the subject we covered so far, please feel free to use the Q&A panel. Moving on now to the second part of the webinar, we will look a bit more into details at the introductory elements. First, we will start by the title. How should the title be structured? As you can see here, the title can be composed of different parts. You have to have a main element, which clarifies the subject, what it is that the standard is about. If you want, you can add an introductory element, which indicates a bit more the broader field of your document. And if you have a part in a series, you will need to add a complementary element to distinguish every part of the same series. So let me show you an example. So as you can see, the red part here is the main element, safety. Then you have the introductory element, which is drilling and foundation equipment. And you have the complementary element, the part 1 title, common requirements. Something that you'll have to keep in mind is that if you have a series of standards, both the main element and the introductory element shall be the same throughout the series. The title page is actually provided by CCMC and will be attached to the document. In the title page, you will have the English title, but if you do have the French and the German title, you can provide them to us. But you have to know that we will send the draft alongside with the title to our translators in DKE, DIN and AFNOR, and they might come up with another proposition for their title. So now Leah will talk about the foreword in a bit more detail.
Okay, so on the next slide for the European foreword, what type of information should you include in the European foreword? Well, for most elements, such as the superseding note and responsible TC, the STD template will give the required wording based on the doc info provided, which Cynthia has already shown. However, there is some additional information that the TC can provide. This includes, very importantly, a list of technical changes from the previous version of the document, if this new document is superseding another or an older version of the text. This is actually something that will be required at publication stage, so it is good to keep in mind. And also important is the relationship of the document to any other documents or to parts in a series. You can provide a list of all the parts that are in the same series. Important to note for the European foreword, according to the IR3, it cannot contain any requirements, recommendations, figures, or tables. Here are just a couple of examples. One for SEN and for SENELEC. As you can see, there are some differences between the two. For SEN, we've chosen an excerpt from an actual draft standard. You can see examples of modifications that they've used here for this text. For SENELEC, this is actually a template of the SENELEC foreword, but I think also a very useful guideline when you're drafting the new European foreword for a SENELEC text. It should be useful. Okay, and I will now move on to the next element, which is the introduction. Is it necessary to have an introduction? No, this is an optional element, as we've mentioned earlier. However, if you do have an introduction, the type of information that might be included here, for one, an introduction will often describe the content of the standards, sometimes providing a little bit of background. It can give information also on why the standard is needed. Importantly, too, if patent rights have been identified for a document, the information regarding the patent rights has to appear in an introduction. There are more details given in the IR3 in Annex F. Subclause numbering is not recommended for introduction, but if needed, please use 0 and not 1, which is reserved for the scope. And lastly, for an introduction, it shall not contain any requirements. This is always important.
Okay, so now last but not least, we shall talk about the scope. What is the purpose of the scope? The scope actually defines the subject of the document. You can use in the scope a series of statements of fact that you can find in the blue square. So usually these are the sentences you will find in a scope. This European standard establishes, or this European standard is not applicable to. If you want to have a look at our Senelec website, you will see what the scope looks like. So on the website you can find all information related to a particular standard. You will have the reference, the title, the work item, and as you can see here, the whole scope. Something really important to keep in mind also is that you shall not have any requirements in the scope. The scope is purely informative.
Okay, we'd like to thank you very much for your attention during the presentation. We will now just take a quick pause to go through some of the questions, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Okay, one of the first questions we have was asking whether the SEN template is aligned with the IEC template. Actually, they are not identical, but Senelec committees can also use the SEN template because both are based on, well, the SEN template is based on the IR3, which is also based on the ISO directives part 2, so they have the same elements. So for Senelec committees, you can also use the SEN template.
Okay, the second question we have is about the compatibility between the old and the new template. Well, of course, it does work. If you have an old document, you can still open it with the new template. And I think I showed also before the way to update all the document information. Once you've updated the information, then it will work also. You get to use the same thing, same template. It works with the new one.
Okay, our next question referred to sometimes mistakes in the standards coming from normative references, and we've been asked, is there a way to make it automatic? As we've shown, when you enter the elements in the choose the elements for the template, and you get the boilerplate text for normative references, and that will always be updated. But for the references themselves, in other words, to ensure that it is the most updated version of the reference, that the title of the reference is correct, we actually, when we receive the document to edit, we run it through an Xstyles tool in order to create XML of this document. And when we do so, the Xstyles tool actually helps to check all of the titles and the dates and information of the references by going through our database, through Midas or projects, to check that everything is correct. And it also tells us if there's a superseding document or if a document has been replaced or withdrawn. So this isn't done through the template. The TC can enter all of the information that is needed for the standard, and we will always double check it when we edit using the Xstyles tool. Okay, the next question we have is for a European forward of an EN ISO. How is it possible to integrate a specific sentence before the ratification because the forward is drafted by CCMC? That is true that for EN ISOs at CCMC we prepare the European forward. If there is any text that needs to be integrated at that stage, you can simply send an email to production@censenelec.eu. The link is actually shown at the end of our webinar on the last slide. And we can integrate any necessary text when we prepare the European foreword. Those are actually all of the questions that we have at this time. So I just ask if anyone else has any further questions, please submit them at this time. Okay, that's all the questions that we have at this time, but if anyone comes up with anything additional, please feel free to email us at production@censenelec.eu. I also want to make you aware, in case you're interested, you can join us for the next webinar for standard drafters. This will take place on the 27th of May, and the topic for this webinar will be normative references and terms and definitions. We'd like to thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you a lovely afternoon. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.